Welcome to a journey back in time, into an age of kings and conquests, of rolling green hills and thatched roof cottages, of turbulent skies hanging over a land on the brink of change. Tonight, we'll explore one of the most pivotal moments in English history, the Norman Conquest of 1066, a year when swords clashed, kings fell, and the very fabric of a nation began to transform. But before we begin, let's set the scene. Imagine England in the 11th century. The landscape stretches before us, dotted with quiet villages where peasants tend to their fields by day and rest by the glow of a flickering hearth at night. Vast forests cover the countryside, teeming with deer and boar, the silent witnesses to centuries of human toil and triumph. The people live under the rule of King Edward, known as Edward the Confessor, a devout and respected monarch. His reign has brought relative peace to the land, but beneath this tranquility lies a simmering uncertainty. Edward has no heir, and the question of succession looms heavy over the kingdom. Who will ascend the throne when the king passes? To the north, across the cold seas, a Viking king named Harold Hardrada harbors his own ambitions for England. To the south, in Normandy, a cunning duke named William sharpens his plans, claiming promises made to him by Edward himself. And in England, Harold Godwinson, Edward's trusted noble, waits, poised to defend his homeland or seize the crown for himself. The year 1066 is a stage set for conflict. 3 men, 3 claims, and 1 throne. England's destiny hangs in the balance. But tonight, as we delve into these events, let the story unfold at its own gentle pace. There's no need to rush. History, after all, is patient, waiting for us to uncover its layers one detail at a time. So, find a comfortable place to rest, close your eyes if you'd like, and let the echoes of the past guide you. Together, we'll wander through this tale of ambition, battle, and legacy, a story that shaped not only England, but the very course of Western history. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The year 1066. Now let us travel deeper into the year 1066, a year that would forever alter the course of England's history. Picture a land shaped by rolling green hills, dense forests, and quiet villages, where life moves to the rhythm of the seasons. But this peace is fragile, for the winds of change have begun to stir. Our story begins in January, in the grand halls of Westminster. King Edward, known as Edward the Confessor, lies on his deathbed. Edward is remembered for his deep piety, a man devoted to God, but less so to the intricacies of governance. He had no children, and with his passing, the question of succession becomes a pressing concern for the realm. On January 5th, 1066, Edward breathes his last, and his passing sends ripples of uncertainty across the land. The very next day, his trusted noble, Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, is crowned king. The ceremony is swift and efficient, taking place in Westminster Abbey, a symbol of Harold's determination to secure the throne before rivals can act. But not everyone accepts Harold's claim. Across the North Sea, in the cold, windswept lands of Norway, King Harold Hardrada listens with interest. Hardrada, whose name means hard ruler, is a man of great ambition and military prowess. He believes the English throne is his by right, a legacy of an old agreement between his predecessors and the Danish kings who once ruled England. With this in mind, he begins to gather an army, a force of Vikings eager to reclaim lost glory. Meanwhile, in Normandy, Duke William watches events unfold. William claims that Edward had promised him the throne years earlier, even securing an oath of loyalty from Harold Godwinson himself. Whether this promise was real or fabricated is a matter lost to history, but to William, it is enough. The Duke begins making meticulous preparations for an invasion. Ships are built, supplies are gathered, and soldiers are trained. William is not a man to take risks lightly. He knows that conquering England will require strength, strategy, and a measure of divine favor. And so, as winter fades and spring blossoms across the countryside, England finds itself at the center of a brewing storm. Harold Godwinson, now King Harold II, works tirelessly to consolidate his rule. He forges alliances with powerful nobles and bolsters the kingdom's defenses. His spies bring him word of William's preparations in Normandy and Hardrada's ambitions in Norway. Harold knows he must be ready for war on more than one front. By summer, rumors of invasion swirl across the kingdom. Farmers and villagers near the coasts gaze out to sea, wondering if the distant sails they spot belong to merchants or invaders. England's shores have long been a target for raiders, but this year the stakes are higher than ever. The throne itself is at risk. In September, the storm finally breaks, but not in the south, as many had expected. Instead, it comes from the north. Harold Hardrada, the Viking king, lands his fleet in Yorkshire, joined by Tostig Godwinson, Harold's estranged brother. Together, they form a formidable force, capturing the city of York and striking fear into the hearts of the English. The news reaches Harold in the south, and his response is swift. With remarkable determination, he gathers his forces and begins a grueling march northward. Imagine the sight: thousands of men, clad in chainmail and carrying shields, trekking through the English countryside. They march by day and camp by night, their journey fueled by a mix of loyalty and necessity, for they know that failure to meet the Viking threat could spell disaster for their kingdom. On September 25th, the two armies meet at Stamford Bridge, near the River Derwent. The battle that follows is fierce and brutal. Hardrada's forces, though seasoned warriors, are caught off guard by Harold's rapid advance. The English shield wall, a formidable tactic, proves its worth as the two sides clash. For hours, the air is filled with the sounds of battle, the clang of swords, the shouts of warriors, and the cries of the wounded. Harold Hardrada, the great Viking king, fights valiantly, but falls in the heat of combat. Tostig, too, meets his end on the battlefield. With their leaders slain, the Viking army crumbles. Harold Godwinson has achieved a hard-fought victory, and for a moment, it seems that England's immediate peril has passed. But victories in war are often bittersweet. Harold's army is exhausted and battered, having marched hundreds of miles and fought a brutal battle. As they rest and tend to their wounds, a messenger arrives with dire news. Duke William of Normandy has landed in the south, near the village of Pevensey. His invasion force is fresh, disciplined, and well prepared. The Norman threat has arrived. Once again, Harold is faced with an impossible task. He must march his army south, covering the same great distance in an even shorter time. The strain on his men is immense, yet they march with determination, knowing that their homeland's very survival depends on their efforts. Imagine the scene. Villagers along the way watch in awe as the army passes. Some offer food or water, others simply stand in silence, sensing the gravity of the moment. Harold's men march through day and night, their journey marked by resolve and exhaustion. By early October, Harold reaches the south, where he establishes his position near the town of Hastings. The English and Norman armies now stand on the brink of a decisive confrontation. The stakes could not be higher. one battle will determine the future of England. And so, as the leaves of autumn fall and the days grow shorter, the stage is set for one of the most significant battles in history. 2 armies, 2 leaders, and 1 throne. The events of 1066 are far from over. For now, let us pause and reflect. Imagine the weary soldiers resting beneath the stars, the anxious villagers waiting for news, and the leaders preparing for the challenges that lie ahead. The year 1066 continues to unfold, its story a tapestry of ambition, sacrifice, and fate. Chapter 2: The Battle of Hastings. As the dawn of October 14th, 1066, broke over the hills of Sussex, the fields near the town of Hastings stirred with the quiet tension of an approaching storm. The air was crisp and heavy with the knowledge that this day would change the course of England's history. On one side of the battlefield stood Harold Godwinson, King of England, and his weary yet resolute army. They had marched hundreds of miles from their victory at Stamford Bridge to face a new threat, an army of Normans led by Duke William, a man as ambitious as he was determined. Harold's forces were composed largely of housecarls, his elite soldiers and herdsmen, local levies called to arms. Many of these men were farmers and tradesmen who had left their homes to defend their kingdom. They carried axes, spears, and shields, their armor battered from the trials of recent weeks. Yet they stood shoulder to shoulder, forming the formidable shield wall that was the hallmark of Anglo-Saxon warfare. Across the field, Duke William's army awaited the signal to advance. His forces were well rested and meticulously organized. The Normans were a diverse and disciplined host, consisting of archers, infantry, and cavalry, a rarity in England at the time. These mounted knights, clad in chainmail and armed with lances, were a symbol of Norman innovation and power. William himself sat astride a great war-horse, his banner fluttering in the cool morning breeze. Between these 2 armies lay Senlac Hill, the chosen site of battle. Harold's forces had taken the high ground, forming a strong defensive position atop the ridge. From their vantage point, they could see the Norman lines stretching across the valley below, a sea of glinting armor and pennants. For hours the 2 sides prepared, the silence punctuated only by the sounds of men donning their gear, murmuring prayers, and tightening the grips on their weapons. And then, with a single command, the battle began. The Normans advanced first, their archers releasing volleys of arrows into the sky. These arrows fell upon the English ranks like rain, but the shield wall held firm. The English shields locked together in an unbroken line, absorbing the brunt of the attack. Harold's men, steadfast and disciplined, waited for the Normans to close the distance. Next came the Norman infantry, charging up the hill with swords and spears. The clash of steel echoed across the valley as the 2 armies met. The shield wall, bolstered by the strength and determination of Harold's housecarls, proved impenetrable. Wave after wave of Norman soldiers were repelled, their efforts frustrated by the steadfast Anglo-Saxon defense. But William was not a man to be easily discouraged. He called upon his cavalry, the pride of the Norman army, to break the English lines. The mounted knights thundered up the hill, their lances aimed at the heart of the shield wall. Yet, even against this fearsome charge, the English stood their ground. Spears and axes struck down the charging horses, and the hill became a chaotic tangle of men and beasts. For hours the battle raged. The sun climbed higher into the sky, casting its light upon a battlefield littered with fallen soldiers. The Normans launched attack after attack, and still the shield wall held. It seemed that Harold's strategy and the high ground would secure his victory. But then, something unexpected happened. a rumor spread among the Norman ranks that Duke William had been killed. Panic began to ripple through the soldiers, and for a brief moment, the Norman army faltered. Men hesitated, and some even began to retreat. William, realizing the danger, acted swiftly. He removed his helmet and rode along the front lines, shouting to his men that he was alive. His presence and leadership steadied the army, and the Normans regrouped for another assault. This time, William employed a new tactic, a feigned retreat. His cavalry turned and appeared to flee down the hill, luring some of Harold's men into pursuit. As the English broke ranks to chase the Normans, William's forces turned back and counterattacked, exploiting the gaps in the shield wall. This maneuver proved devastating. The battle continued into the late afternoon, with both sides exhausted yet unwilling to yield. And then, in one fateful moment, Harold Godwinson fell. Accounts differ as to how he died. Some say he was struck by an arrow to the eye, while others suggest he was cut down by Norman knights. What is certain is that Harold's death marked the turning point of the battle. Without their king, the English resistance began to crumble. As the sun dipped low in the sky, the Normans pressed their advantage. The shield wall, once unbreakable, dissolved as Harold's forces retreated or were cut down. By nightfall, the field belonged to Duke William and his army. The Battle of Hastings was over, but the cost of victory was immense. The battlefield was strewn with the bodies of thousands of men, both English and Norman. The air was heavy with the scent of blood and smoke, and the cries of the wounded echoed into the night. It was a scene of devastation, a sobering reminder of the price of ambition and power. Duke William, now known to history as William the Conqueror, had achieved his goal. Yet his work was far from done. The conquest of England had only just begun, and the challenges of ruling a divided and resistant kingdom lay ahead. For now, let us leave the battlefield behind. Imagine the quiet that descended after the fighting ceased, the weary soldiers resting under the stars, and the villagers in nearby towns awaiting news of what had transpired. The events of this day would be remembered for centuries to come, etched into the fabric of England's history. The Battle of Hastings was not just a clash of armies, but a turning point, a moment that shaped the destiny of a nation. Chapter 3: Aftermath and Consolidation. As the sun rose on the morning after the Battle of Hastings, a heavy silence hung over the fields of Sussex. Where there had been the clash of swords and the cries of battle, now there was only stillness. The ground, once green and soft, was trampled and stained with the blood of thousands. The dead lay scattered across the hillside, a somber testament to the ferocity of the conflict. For Duke William of Normandy, the victory at Hastings was monumental, yet the battlefield was only the beginning of his journey. Claiming a crown through conquest was one thing, keeping it was another. The task that lay before him was immense, the consolidation of power in a land that was deeply divided. The first step in William's path to consolidation was securing the throne itself. After the death of Harold Godwinson, the Witan, or Council of Nobles, sought to crown Edgar Atheling, the last surviving male of the Anglo-Saxon royal line. Edgar was young, barely more than a boy, but his lineage made him a symbol of English resistance. However, William acted quickly. He marched his army to London, burning villages and strongholds along the way to instill fear and assert his authority. Imagine the sight of the Norman army, weary from battle yet relentless, advancing toward the heart of England. Their presence was a stark reminder of the new order taking shape. As William's forces approached, London's leaders, exhausted and fearful of further destruction, submitted. Edgar's claim to the throne was quietly set aside, and on Christmas Day in 1066, in Westminster Abbey, William was crowned King of England. The coronation itself was a tense affair. As the assembled crowd shouted their acclamations, Norman guards outside the abbey mistook the noise for an uprising and set fire to nearby buildings. Chaos erupted, and many attendees fled in panic. Amid the confusion, William maintained his composure, completing the ceremony that officially made him William the Conqueror. But being crowned king was only the first step. England was still a land of deep-seated loyalties and regional identities. Resistance to Norman rule simmered across the country, particularly in the north, where the legacy of Anglo-Saxon and Viking influence remained strong. Over the next few years, William faced a series of uprisings and rebellions. One of the most significant revolts occurred in 1069, when the northern earls, supported by Danish forces, rose against Norman rule. The rebellion spread quickly, and for a time, it seemed that William might lose control of the region. But William responded with ruthless efficiency. He led his army north, crushing the rebellion with brutal force. To ensure that no further uprisings would take root, he ordered what became known as the Harrying of the North. The harrying was a campaign of scorched earth. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and livestock slaughtered. Thousands of people were left homeless and starving in the harsh northern winters. While effective in breaking resistance, it left a lasting scar on the region, and its memory endured as a dark chapter in William's reign. With rebellion subdued, William turned his attention to solidifying his control over the land. He introduced the feudal system, a hierarchy of governance that bound lords and vassals to the king through oaths of loyalty. Norman nobles were granted large estates, often at the expense of Anglo-Saxon landowners, who were displaced or reduced in status. This redistribution of land created a new ruling class, loyal to William and deeply invested in maintaining his authority. Imagine the transformation of the English countryside during these years. Where once stood Anglo-Saxon manors, now rose Norman castles, fortresses of stone and power that dotted the landscape. These castles served as both military strongholds and symbols of Norman dominance. Perhaps the most famous of these was the Tower of London, begun shortly after William's coronation. Its imposing structure loomed over the city, a constant reminder of the new order. But William's consolidation was not limited to politics and military might. He also sought to understand and manage his new kingdom with precision. In 1086, he commissioned the creation of the Domesday Book, a comprehensive survey of landholdings, resources, and taxes across England. This remarkable document provided a detailed snapshot of medieval England, allowing William to effectively govern and tax his realm. The Domesday Book was more than an administrative tool. It was a symbol of William's control. To the English people, it seemed as final and inescapable as the Last Judgment itself, hence its ominous name. Yet, it also reflected William's pragmatic approach to rule, blending his Norman ambitions with the practical realities of governing a diverse and complex kingdom. Under William's reign, the cultural landscape of England began to shift. The Anglo-Saxon language, once dominant, began to blend with Norman French, giving rise to the early forms of Middle English. This linguistic fusion would shape the English language as we know it today. Norman influences also left their mark on art, architecture, and law, intertwining the two cultures in ways both subtle and profound. And so, As the years passed, William's grip on England tightened. He had faced rebellion and resistance, but through a combination of military strength, administrative innovation, and calculated pragmatism, he transformed the kingdom into a unified and stable realm. But William's conquest came at a cost. The Norman rule brought upheaval, displacing countless Anglo-Saxon families and disrupting centuries-old traditions. For many, the Norman Conquest was a time of loss and hardship, its scars visible for generations. As we reflect on these years of consolidation, let us imagine the people who lived through them, the villagers rebuilding their homes after the harrying of the North, the craftsmen laboring to construct castles and cathedrals, the scribes recording the contents of the Domesday Book. Their stories, though often overshadowed by the grand narratives of kings and conquests, are no less a part of history. For William, the Battle of Hastings had been only the beginning. The years that followed were a testament to his determination and vision, as well as the resilience of the people whose lives were forever changed by his rule. The legacy of the Norman Conquest, forged in blood and ambition, would shape England for centuries to come. Chapter 4: The Legacy of the Norman Conquest. As the dust of battle settled and the years passed, the Norman Conquest of 1066 began to fade into memory, yet its impact continued to resonate across the land. The changes ushered in by Duke William and his followers would shape the very identity of England, leaving a legacy that endures to this day. Let us take a step back and reflect on the ripples of the Norman Conquest. Imagine the lives of those who lived in its shadow, the peasants working the fields, the nobility navigating a transformed social order, and the scribes documenting the evolving culture. Their stories form the fabric of a nation forever changed. One of the most immediate and enduring impacts of the conquest was the transformation of England's ruling class. Before 1066, the Anglo-Saxon elite had governed the land, a nobility deeply rooted in centuries of tradition. But with William's victory came a seismic shift. Norman lords, loyal to the new king, were granted vast estates, often at the expense of dispossessed Anglo-Saxon landowners. Within a generation, the English aristocracy was almost entirely replaced, its ancient lineage supplanted by Norman names and faces. Imagine the halls of these new Norman estates, bustling with the language of the conquerors. Norman French became the tongue of the court and the nobility, while Anglo-Saxon English lingered among the common people. Over time, these two languages began to merge, creating the early forms of Middle English, a linguistic blend that would one day give rise to the language we speak today. Words of governance, law, and chivalry were borrowed from French, enriching the vocabulary and changing the way people communicated. But the Normans left their mark on more than just language. Across the English countryside, the landscape itself began to change. Towering castles rose from the earth, their stone walls a stark contrast to the timber fortifications of old. These castles were not merely homes. They were symbols of power, fortresses of control, designed to dominate the land and its people. Among these, the Tower of London stood as a shining example, a structure that still commands respect and awe centuries later. Imagine the hands that built these castles, masons, laborers, and craftsmen toiling under the watchful eyes of their Norman overseers. Their work reshaped England's skyline, and their efforts laid the foundations for a new era of architecture. The Romanesque style, characterized by rounded arches and thick stone walls, began to take root, soon giving way to the soaring Gothic cathedrals that would define the Middle Ages. Yet, for all the grandeur of castles and cathedrals, the Norman conquest was not without hardship. The harrying of the north, a brutal campaign to suppress rebellion, left entire regions desolate. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and countless lives lost. The scars of this devastation lingered for generations, a dark reminder of the cost of conquest. Still, the Normans brought more than just destruction. Under William's rule, England became a more centralized and organized kingdom. The Domesday Book, commissioned in 1086, was a monumental achievement, a detailed survey of land, resources, and taxes across the realm. This document not only demonstrated William's administrative acumen, but also provided an invaluable glimpse into medieval life. To this day, historians turn to the Domesday Book as a window into the world of 11th century England. Beyond the borders of England, the Norman conquest had far-reaching consequences. Norman influence spread to Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, leaving its mark on the political and cultural landscapes of the British Isles. The Normans brought with them new ideas of governance and warfare, transforming not just England, but its neighbors as well. And yet, the legacy of the conquest is more than just castles and kings. It is also the story of a people who adapted to profound change. Over time, the lines between conqueror and conquered began to blur. Marriages between Normans and Anglo-Saxons created a new blended culture, one that drew from both traditions to forge something unique. By the time of the Plantagenet kings, just a few generations after William, the distinction between Norman and English had begun to fade. The descendants of Norman lords no longer saw themselves as foreign conquerors, but as Englishmen, stewards of the land they had claimed. And so, as the centuries passed, the Norman conquest became a chapter in the story of England, a chapter filled with conflict and transformation, but also with resilience and renewal. Its legacy can be felt in the words we speak, the buildings that surround us, and the very structure of society. Let us pause here and imagine the echoes of those days. Picture the bustling markets, where traders sold their goods in a mix of English and French. Imagine the quiet chapels where prayers were offered in Latin, a language that united the church across Europe. And think of the hands that built the castles and tilled the fields, shaping a nation with their labor and their lives. The Norman conquest was not just a moment in time, it was the beginning of a journey that took England from the age of Anglo-Saxon kings to the dawn of a new era. And as we reflect on this legacy, we see that history is not merely the story of rulers and battles. It is the story of change, of adaptation, and of the enduring spirit of a people. The story of 1066 lives on, not only in the pages of history books, but in the landscapes, the language, and the culture of England today. It is a story of resilience and transformation, one that reminds us of the power of history to shape the present and inspire the future. Conclusion. And so, we come to the end of this story, a tale of ambition, conflict, and transformation that began with a claim to a throne and ended with a kingdom forever changed. The Norman conquest of 1066 was more than just a single event. It was a turning point, a moment when the threads of history were rewoven, creating a tapestry that still shapes the world today. Let us pause and look back over the journey we've taken together. We've walked the quiet roads of 11th century England, where farmers toiled in the fields and villagers whispered of impending change. We've stood on the battlefield at Hastings, where swords clashed and the fate of a kingdom was decided. We've seen the rise of castles and cathedrals, symbols of a new era, and we've reflected on the legacy left behind, the language, the culture, the governance, all of which still echo in modern England. But beyond the grand events and monumental changes, this is also a story of people, the soldiers who fought bravely for their kings, the villagers who adapted to new rulers, the scribes who recorded the changes, and the masons and craftsmen who built a new landscape. Their lives, though often overlooked, are woven into the fabric of this history. The Norman Conquest reminds us that history is not a fixed narrative but a living story, shaped by those who experience it and retold by those who remember. It teaches us that even in moments of great upheaval, there is resilience, and in times of change, there is renewal. As we close this chapter of history, imagine the quiet countryside of medieval England once more. The sun sets over rolling hills, casting long shadows on the land. A farmer returns home after a long day, the fields behind him still bearing the scars of recent conflicts. In a castle high on a hill, a Norman lord surveys his domain, contemplating the challenges of ruling this ancient land. And in a village chapel, the soft murmur of prayers rises, offering hope for the future. These moments, small and great, remembered and forgotten, are what make history so profound. They remind us of the shared human experience that transcends time, connecting us to those who came before and those who will come after. So now, as the echoes of 1066 fade into the quiet of the night, let your mind drift to thoughts of resilience, of change, and of the enduring power of history. Close your eyes and let the past guide you gently into dreams of what once was and what could be. Good night.